Hello class, this is Jesse. The content covered in this video, so brain structures and functions, will be things that you will find on your exam. So do take note of this information and study it well. Other than that, let's just jump right into it. First, we're going to talk about the directional terminology and planes of reference of the brain. And here we have a great illustration of everything we need. Let's go ahead and start with the directional terminology. Here in the front of the brain, we have the anterior and/or rostral area of the brain. And those two terms, anterior and rostral, which unfortunately isn't shown, those are interchangeable terms. They are analogous to each other and you can use either one. And that is the same for the other interchangeable terms I will announce throughout the rest of the video. If we go to the back of the brain here, we have the posterior and/or caudal area of the brain, this tail end of the brain. And if you look above to the top of your head, the top of your brain, you have the superior and/or dorsal area. And I prefer dorsal. It's an easy way to remember the top, like the top of a dolphin or shark with their dorsal fin, as opposed to the bottom part of the brain, this bottom area known as the inferior and/or ventral area of the brain. So an example of discussing areas, you would say the pituitary gland, for instance, is in the inferior and/or ventral area of the brain. And you will see that later. We will discuss that. Now let's look at the spinal cord, which together, along with the brain, makes up the central nervous system. The spinal cord, if you notice, takes on slightly different orientation and/or axis. If you consider this right here, the anterior and posterior, the x-axis, and the superior and inferior, the y-axis, you would expect this to be anterior and posterior. However, it's different. And this is because the spinal cord is 9 degrees in reference to the brain. You can kind of imagine a 9-degree angle right here. So rather than this x-axis just jumping down to the spinal cord, it's the y-axis that actually takes a 90-degree turn, making this side now dorsal and this side now ventral. And this stays the same, this new axis, for the rest of your body. So your ears, for instance, now are anterior in reference to your body, while your feet are posterior. So do know and do remember that the spinal cord and brain, the two hemispheres here, take on slightly different orientation. Now, these planes of reference are great examples of the cuts we would do during the actual dissection in lab. We would not do this horizontal section. However, we would do this coronal and/or frontal section where we would cut along this plane here. And we would see exactly this, but I'd like to focus on the new terminology, medial and lateral. Medial, I like to remember that as the middle components, the middle structures, the middle view of the brain or respective area of the body. And the more left or right you go from there, you get more lateral. This is the same here for this mid-sagittal cut, where we would cut along this plane of reference and see this perfect middle section or medial section of the brain. And again, we see this same terminology that helps orient ourselves. And fun fact, if you want to do a more sagittal cut, you would do a parasagittal cut and see a more lateral area of the brain. Once again, we have medial and lateral shown for the spinal cord, which takes on the same directionality. Okay, now we're going to do a thorough external examination of the brain. And this begins with the meninges, which was shown here below. But above the meninges is the scalp and cranium, which also contribute to protecting your brain, which is shown below. There is also another layer not shown in this image, unfortunately, and that is the periosteum, this thin, filmy white layer that you may have seen if you had a thick cut on your scalp. And that is a coating for your bones, in this case, the cranium or skull. As for the meninges, we have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. So these layers here, 1, 2, 3, those 3 components make up the meninges. And they all work in unison to keep your brain here in suspension. So what the meninges do is that they help your brain not bang back and forth within your cranium or skull, because I'm sure you can imagine why that would be a very bad thing. So damage and/or infection to the meninges is a very dangerous thing, such as meningitis, which is inflammation of the meninges all along your brain and all the way down your spinal cord. And here you can see a realistic image of the meninges on human brain. So the dura mater here, the arachnoid matter, which is yet to be removed, and the pia mater you'd expect underneath. And I love this image where you can see the scalp, the periosteum, the cranium, the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, the pia mater, and the cerebral cortex or brain tissue. Well, here we have the cerebral cortex, which is part of the forebrain, as well as two different views of it, a superior and or dorsal view of a sheep brain. And by the way, this is a type of brain we would have used in the actual lab. And below we have another image of the lateral view of the left hemisphere, it looks like, the human brain. And here we have the four different lobes that would be on both hemispheres, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And in short, what the lobes do is that the frontal lobe is an association area for somatic motor function. So that would be voluntary actions your body commits. It is also associated in supervising other functions of the cerebral cortex, integrating that data or that information, and regulating executive function, which is what makes it so important in rationale, future planning, and essentially all decision making. And how we have here the parietal lobe, which is more medial in respect to the brain. And this part of the brain is mainly associated with somatic sensory information. So allowing you to sense things such as temperature, pressure, or pain. It is also involved in spatial manipulation and association, which is what allows us to perceive ourselves and abstract objects in three-dimensional space. A great example of usage of this part of the brain is our ability to read maps. The temporal lobe here, more lateral, this part of the brain is mainly associated with most auditory processing. And as for the occipital lobe at the rear, it is mainly associated with visual processing. It has also been associated with learning and motor skills, along with the frontal lobe. And here we have just a quick summary, some bullet points of the lobes and their function. Go ahead and take some notes here and take a break if you'd like. And as for me, I'm going to move on. Here we have the cerebral hemispheres. And I'd like you to first notice this canyon, it looks like, between the two hemispheres. And this is known as the longitudinal fissure. This is what you would look for, the separation, when doing that mid-sagittal cut that you saw in the directionality slide of the brain. I'd also like you to notice the corpus callosum. This is very important. It is an interconnection between the two hemispheres. It's what allows the two hemispheres to communicate with each other. And you will see this again. Also along with the cerebellum, which we will discuss later, and the spinal cord. Notably right now, let's look at the left and right cerebral hemispheres. The left hemisphere is known more often than not as the dominant hemisphere. And as you can see here, it's primarily analytic and well suited for managing details. It is also the area of language creation, the ability to speak language, and also language comprehension. Then you have the right cerebral hemisphere, which is more often not known as the non-dominant hemisphere. And again, you can see it's associated with intuition, music, cognition, and spatial processing. It's extremely sensitive to emotional tone and recognizes moods based off facial features, which are two things that allow human conversation to be so expressive and dynamic. And here we have the cranial nerves. For your exam, the functions of these nerves is a little bit out of scope for this class. So what I'd encourage you to know is how many there are. And there are 12 different cranial nerves on the ventral side of the brain. For the spinal cord, fun fact, there are another 31 pairs of nerves that all have their respective physiological function in your body. Here we have again another ventral view of the brain. We have the midbrain clearly diagrammed here, which we will discuss in the next slide. And we have the pons and medulla oblongata. And these are part of the hindbrain, as well as the cerebellum, which is not labeled here. And the pons, what this does is a very important interconnection between the spinal cord, medulla oblongata, and the cerebral cortex. So it plays a very important role. As for the medulla oblongata, this controls autonomic functions in your body. involuntary functions that you have no conscious control over, things such as blood pressure, heart rate, digestion, and breathing. These basic vital functions you cannot live without. So again, another very important role in the body. So here we have this superior and or dorsal view of the brain with the spinal cord and cerebellum being pulled back slightly, as you can see here, to allow identification of key structures. Two key structures are the inferior and superior colunculus or colunculi, and these two components are part of the midbrain here. They are the top side of this structure, and the inferior colunculus is involved in receiving auditory information, while the superior colunculus is involved in receiving visual information. And both together play a very important role in reflexive reaction time to very bright light or very sudden sounds. Again, these two are part of the midbrain. And then you have the pineal body here. And this will be discussed later, along with the fourth ventricle, which is shown here. And this is part of the ventricular system, which we will also talk about later. And then you have the cerebellum, which all in all controls body coordination and bodily movement. So a very important part of your brain with complex function. And moving on now to the quick summary of the two. Again, here I've listed the cerebellum, pons, and medulla oblongata, which are all part of the hindbrain, and the superior and inferior colunculus or colunculi, which are part of the midbrain. And now we'll go into an internal examination of the brain. Here we have the mid-sagittal section of the brain. This is a cut we would have done during the actual dissection of the brain. And I know this is quite a busy slide, but I'll go over all of the identified features, but only go into detail on those most important for your exam. And we'll go ahead and start here with the fornix. The fornix sits below the corpus callosum and above the thalamus. And again, here you have the corpus callosum, which is that interconnection between the two hemispheres. And here we have the pineal gland, which you saw before. This gland is associated with controlling circadian rhythms, notably when to go to sleep through the secretion of melatonin. And here we have the cerebellum, which we discussed earlier. And a very notable feature that was on my exam, perhaps will be on yours, is this tree-like structure of white matter composed within the cerebellum called the arbor vitae. So do remember that term. And very importantly, we have the thalamus here, which is the main relay center of the brain. 4 out of your 5 senses relay through the thalamus to the respective areas of the brain. The only sense that does not relay through here is the olfactory sense and or smell, making that sense the most immediate. And we have the mammillary gland here and the hypothalamus, which sits below the thalamus. And this is involved in, best known to control the 4 F's. So that would be feeding, fighting, flighting, and sexual functioning. So very much involved in the parasympathetic nervous system. It is also well known for being the interconnection between the neurological system and the endocrine system, so the secretion of hormones. And also very well known for controlling homeostasis and or equilibrium within your body in regards to metabolism, temperature, and water balance. And what is not shown here that protrudes or is an extension of the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, which you would expect approximately around here. And the pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus and is very much involved in hormone secretion into the bloodstream. And here we have the optic chiasm. And just for fun, we have the pons, which would be around here, the medulla oblongata, and the midbrain, right here. And here we just have bullet points of the main structures to consider and study for the exam. Here we have again that mid-sagittal cut and or section of the brain, looking at a medial view, right, a middle view. And here we have all the different ventricles of the brain. The third ventricle, the lateral ventricle here, right, sitting above the fornix and corpus callosum and below the and above the thalamus. The third ventricle at the end of the corpus callosum. The fourth ventricle here, which seeps into the cerebellum, and the cerebral aqueduct, another ventricle that sits above the midbrain. And now what these ventricles do is that they create cerebral spinal fluid, and they help keep your brain lubricated and in suspension with, of course, the help of the meninges. And all four of these make up the ventricular system. And now we're going to do a look at a coronal and or frontal cut or section of the brain. This is part of the section that we would have done in lab. And rather than just looking at one section, I'm going to take a look at three with all of you. Here we have the first cut, and notable structures here are the gray matter and the white matter. Again, the arbor vitae of the cerebellum is composed of the white matter, that tree-like structure. Here we have the thalamus, so repeated structures that you're looking at again, and again, the corpus callosum, and the septum, or the septum on your nose, that separates the ventricular system. Okay, and here we have the other two cuts, number one and number two, again, with frontal perspectives. And you can see other key features. Here you can see the thalamus for its girth, its actual true size, rather than just looking at it at a medial view. Now you can see how it extends laterally into the brain. And we have the hippocampus, which sits adjacent to the thalamus. And the hippocampus is involved in storing long-term memory. So it's a very important part of the brain. And at the end of the hippocampus, which is not quite shown here, is the amygdala. And the amygdala is involved in aggression, anger, and pain. And here we have the fornix. And the fornix helps communication via the hippocampus to other parts of the body and or limbic system. And here in the cut number three, we have the midbrain. And you can see the cerebral aqueduct that you before sat sitting above the midbrain actually runs through it. Okay, finally, we're going to discuss the spinal cord. Okay, and here we have the spinal cord. This is an image taken directly out of your lab notebook. Again, I posted this reference for directionality and, of course, terminology, as you can see. So do take note of this. But I will discuss four of the most important features on this image, starting with the gray and white matter, which you saw uniformly also in the brain. Here is the spinal cord. We have the gray matter and we have the white matter. Now, the distinction between the two is that the gray matter is composed of unmyelinated axons of cell bodies, while the white matter is composed of myelinated axons. Now, if you know of an axon as a component of a neuron, so that's dendrites, the cell body, and the axon. And in short, what myelination does to the axon, I like to think of it as like the fast forward button. It increases the speed in which a signal is sent in the body. And there will be another video discussing action potentials of the axon, how messages or signals propagate through the axon, and myelination will be discussed in more detail. And here we have the sensory neurons and motor neurons that sit within this dorsal root and ventral root. Again, that terminology, you see it again and again. As for sensory neurons, they are also called afferent neurons. And I always like to think of afferent like arriving neurons, because signals and arrive via the sensory neurons. So for instance, if I touched a very hot cup of coffee, that sense, that signal would go from my fingertips and relay through here and arrive at my spinal cord or my central nervous system. As for the motor neurons, which are also called efferent neurons, I always think of efferent as exiting, is where signals leave the central nervous system. So for instance, if I wanted to kick a soccer ball, a signal would leave my central nervous system to my leg to kick that soccer ball. And these neurons, they live within these dorsal and ventral roots, okay? And here you have the ventral horn and dorsal horn, right? These characteristics of the gray matter. And you have this dorsal root ganglion, and you have this sensory neuron soma, and soma means body. So this is just showing a cell body within this ganglion. Here we have a very realistic image of the spinal cord. Again, you can compare the features you can see obviously here with the animated image before. And again, I have summarized the 4 main components you should know for your exam. And this is also in your lab notebook. Other than that, everybody, I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope you are all safe in light of the global pandemic. And man, I see you all next semester. So again, have a great semester. Catch you all later.